Something terrifying is spreading across rural China. Entire villages where cancer has become normal. Families losing fathers, mothers, children, sometimes even generations, to the same diseases. In some places, people say the water burns their skin. Rivers run strange colors. Fish die by the hundreds. And then the cancer starts. These places now have a name: China's cancer villages. Hundreds of communities scattered across the country where pollution from factories, mines, and chemical plants have turned farmland and drinking water into poison. For years, the government barely acknowledged that they existed. Now the evidence is impossible to hide. The crisis isn't isolated, and it isn't slowing down. It may be one of the darkest consequences of China's rise as the world's manufacturing superpower. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what China built and how fast it built it. In 1978, China was a poor, largely closed country. Then Deng Xiaoping opened the gates. What followed was one of the most breathtaking economic transformations in human history. Within 2 decades, China didn't just industrialize, it became the engine that powered the entire global economy. Deng himself once said, "The Middle East has oil, but China has rare earths." He wasn't wrong. Rare earth metals are the hidden backbone of modern civilization. Neodymium, yttrium, cerium, dysprosium. Now, these are names that most people, including myself, can't pronounce, but metals that are everywhere. They're in your smartphone, your car, your laptop, the wind turbines powering clean energy, the fighter jets defending nations, the MRI machines scanning for illness, the EV batteries everyone is rushing to manufacture. If you own any technology built in the last 30 years, there's a rare earth element inside of it, and there's a very good chance that it came from China. Without these materials, the modern world, as we have built it, does not function. Today, China accounts for roughly 70% of all rare earth mining globally, and a staggering 90% of the world's refining and processing. Figures confirmed by both the U.S. Geological Survey and the International Energy Agency as of 2024. The hub of this empire sits in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, a city of roughly 2.7 million people sitting on top of 80% of China's rare earth reserves, pressed up against the edge of the Gobi Desert. Rare earths were first discovered nearby in the 1930s, but production didn't go ballistic until the 1990s, when China's rapid industrialization kicked into overdrive and the world's appetite for electronics became insatiable. And alongside rare earths came everything else: steel mills, chemical plants, textile factories, battery manufacturers, paper mills, oil refineries, fertilizer facilities, smelters, dye factories, pharmaceutical plants. Industry of every shape and size erupting across the landscape. Between 1990 and 2000, China's rare earth output alone surged by 450%. By 2024, the government's annual production quota hit 270,000 metric tons of rare earth oxide. China became the world's workshop, responsible for roughly 1/3 of all global manufacturing output by 2020. The share of global manufacturing exports grew from just 3% in 1995 to 20% by 2020. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. It was, by almost any economic measure, an astounding achievement. But somewhere inside that story, something else was growing. Something invisible, something that took years to show up, and something absolutely deadly. Here's the part that never makes the trade brochures. All that industry, every factory, refinery, smelter, processing plant, it all creates waste, enormous quantities of it. And for decades, much of that waste had exactly one destination: China's river, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Pearl River. These are not minor waterways. The Yangtze alone supplies around 400 million people with fresh water. These rivers are the lifeblood of civilizations stretching back thousands of years, arteries running through the heart of a country that depended on them for drinking, irrigation, fishing, and survival. And companies were allowed to dump directly into them. We're not talking about trace amounts of mildly questionable chemicals. We're talking about arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury, chromium, benzene, sulfates, dioxin, uranium, and radioactive byproducts from rare earth processing, all piped or dumped into these rivers in volumes that defy comprehension. A 1997 study of 45 billion cubic meters of Chinese urban wastewater found more than 40 billion cubic meters were completely untreated before discharge. Billions more were added year after year. 40 billion cubic meters, untreated, unfiltered, dumped into the same river that fed hundreds of millions of people. The worst of it collected in so-called tailings ponds. massive holding sites for industrial sludge. The most notorious is the Whitekang Tailings Dam in Baotou, owned by the state-controlled Baogang Group. Now, for many years, this was the single largest dumping site for rare earth waste on the planet. A lake of toxic gray sludge, never properly lined to protect the surrounding soil. That dam sits in the same water table as the Yellow River. The toxins don't stay contained. They migrate, slowly, silently into the ground. A 2014 government survey, the first to be made public at least, found that nearly 60% of China's underground water was contaminated. Studies suggest that more than 70% of rivers and lakes across the country suffer from some degree of pollution. In the North China Plain, home to roughly 400 million people, 70% of groundwater was found to be unfit for human contact. One environmental campaigner, describing the scale of the contamination, said China's river deltas had become its sewer. Nowhere is the horror more visceral than in Dingshu, a small township in Jiangsu province. Safe levels of cadmium, a heavy metal carcinogen, in agricultural soil sit around 2 milligrams per kilogram. Dingshu's riverbed soil measured 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. 1,500, not 15, not 150. 750 times the safe threshold. And that is one chemical in one township in a country of 1.4 billion people. The same story. Different toxins, different rivers, different communities were playing out thousands of times across the nation. What got into the water eventually got into the crops. What got into the crops got into the people. And eventually, people started dying. Badly. By the late 1990s, doctors and local residents across rural China were noticing something that could no longer be quietly dismissed. Villages where everyone seemed to get sick. The same cancers, same organs, the same age groups, one after another, again and again. The phrase cancer village first appeared in Chinese government documents in 1998. The state's own bureaucrats reaching for a term to describe communities where industrial pollution and catastrophic cancer rates existed side by side. But acknowledgement was not action. The phrase went quiet, and people kept dying. In 2009, a Chinese investigative journalist painstakingly mapped more than 100 of these cancer villages. It seemed shocking at the time. It turned out to be nowhere near the full picture. By the mid-2010s, independent estimates climbed past 450. A peer-reviewed study later confirmed that by the end of 2017, at least 462 cancer villages had been documented across 226 countries, reaching into 29 of China's 31 provincial administrative units. Not scattered along a single river, not concentrated in one region, virtually everywhere. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Researchers calculated an average of 7 new cancer villages appearing every single year. Every year without interruption since the crisis began. Cancer is now China's leading cause of death. As of 2022, the most recent comprehensive national data, China recorded an estimated 4.8 million new cancer cases and 2.57 million cancer deaths in a single year. That's more than 7,000 new diagnoses every single day and roughly 7,000 cancer deaths every day. Not over time, but every day. In the hardest hit communities, the numbers are even more brutal. Researchers have documented settlements where up to 30% of all adults are living with cancer. Communities where you don't just know someone who got sick, you're surrounded by them. Where a diagnosis is not a shock, it's simply expected. Grandparents, parents, children, the same disease moving through the same family in the same generation. The cancers mirror the chemistry of the contamination. Liver, stomach, kidneys, lungs, esophagus, blood. Rare earth particles are fine enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, linked to neurological damage in fetuses and young children. Cadmium accelerating in rice irrigated by poisoned water, driving liver and stomach cancers in communities that have farmed the same fields for generations. Chromium contamination tied to blood cancers. Dense clouds of smog driving emphysema and lung disease in communities where the air itself has become a delivery mechanism. One ecologist named Ho Daishan described a village on the Hai River, one of China's most severely polluted waterways, where residents had no real alternative. The water they drank came from a well filled by this river. The fish they ate came from the same river. The vegetables were irrigated by the same water. The river occasionally ran red, sometimes black, with a layer of foul algae sitting on the surface. It would kill fish, it killed livestock. The people had to eat, they had to drink, and so they did, because the alternative was starvation. This is what desperation looks like. choosing between dying now or dying later from the same water source. And most people in these villages can't leave. Cancer treatment in China is expensive relative to rural incomes. Families drain their savings and then go into debt. Some members take jobs in the very factories responsible for the contamination just to pay for chemotherapy. When the money runs out, the patient waits at home, isolated, often unable to work, unable to afford the next round of treatment, watching time pass. One elderly man named Zhang Damin was interviewed by Reuters in 2014. He and his wife both had cancer. He said, quote, "She and I wake up every day just to await death. There is nothing we can do. There is no hope." Later in the same conversation, speaking of his own death, quote, "I just don't want to die too painfully when the end comes." Think about that. I just don't want to die too painfully when the end comes. A man living in the world's second largest economy, whose country assembled the smartphone in your pocket, and he has no hope? But here's the layer underneath all of this, the part where the story stops being a tragedy and starts becoming something more deliberate. Hey, if this is resonating, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We cover the crises that the rest of the media keep looking away from, because what comes next is where this gets truly dark. While people are dying in these villages, Beijing cooked up a strategy, and it wasn't to clean up. For years, data on contaminated soil in China was officially classified, not delayed, not restricted, a formal state secret, meaning researchers, journalists, and citizens who publicized findings on soil contamination would risk prosecution. The government that created the pollution also controlled the record of its consequences. The pattern was consistent and calculated. Local officials who depended on factory revenues for regional GDP numbers had every incentive to suppress reports of illness or contamination. Factories ran two separate waste pipes, one for treated water displayed to inspectors and one for raw effluent used every other day. An activist named Wei Dongying filmed a factory worker describing exactly this practice in 2015. The worker was matter of fact. Inspectors see the clean pipe, and the community gets the dirty one. And when a cancer village can no longer be denied, when deaths are too visible, when journalists had already arrived, the response was not redemption, it's erasure. Nowhere is this better documented than in Baotou, where the state-owned Baogang Group's infamous tailing ponds were officially declared an urban wetland in 2022. A conservation triumph. Officials mentioned migratory birds. When Western journalists traveled to report on this transformation, they found a freshly constructed concrete wall blocking most of the site from view. Peering over it, they found demolition, rusted pipes, collapsed structures, and the ruins of what had been a cancer village. Residents had been relocated from farmland that their families worked for generations to state apartment blocks. The contamination was still in the ground, and the water table had not been treated. The village was gone, but the poison remained. This was also not isolated. Across China, cancer villages have been demolished, populations dispersed, records removed. And when Beijing formally acknowledged that cancer villages existed for the first time, it was 2013, 15 years after Chinese bureaucrats coined the term, by which point the science had already confirmed 462 of them. Activists who tried to expose the truth found out the price quickly. Wei Dongying spent years investigating more than 60 deaths in her community between 1992 and 2004. She had been arrested dozens of times on fabricated charges, including 10 days in jail for filing a formal complaint against a detergent factory. Followed, monitored, harassed. She said, "The government is obsessed with economic growth, and meanwhile, we ordinary citizens pay the price." The legal architecture made it nearly impossible to assign blame. Dozens of factories contribute dozens of chemicals to a shared water supply. Establishing a direct chain from a specific plant to a specific cancer in a specific person is an extraordinarily difficult task. Industry knows this. The government knows this. The ambiguity is structural, and in many ways, by design. 7 new cancer villages per year, every year. The math does not lie. Now here's something China would prefer that you don't sit with for too long. This crisis was not alone built by China. Every country that relocated its dirty, expensive, tightly regulated manufacturing to China, every corporation that chose cheaper labor and weaker environmental standards over accountability, helped construct the system that poisoned these villages. The trade relationship that the world built over 30 years was, in large part, a transfer of environmental liability. Wealthy nations got cheap goods. China's rural communities absorbed the consequences. The rare earth supply chain is the sharpest illustration. defense industries, tech giants, and clean energy companies across the world depend on materials processed in places like Baotou. The wind turbines and electric vehicles being sold as the solution to climate change require rare earth magnets produced, right now at the cost of human health in Inner Mongolia. The smartphones and laptops consuming rare earth elements at record rates, powered by an environmental bargain the end user never sees and never agreed to. In April 2025, when Beijing imposed export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements in retaliation for U.S. tariffs, factories in the U.S. and Europe were forced to cut production. Some temporarily shut down entirely. The IEA confirms China controls not just 70% of rare earth mining, but 91% of global refining and 94% of sintered permanent magnet production. The disruption lasted weeks and sent shockwaves through supply chains from Detroit to Stuttgart. Global markets got a glimpse of what dependency actually looks like. But the world built an addiction to a supply chain grown on poisoned ground. The people living on that ground had no vote in the arrangement. One resident in a contaminated region was asked why these factories were built in the countryside rather than in China's major cities. The answer was blunt: because in Beijing and Shanghai, there are people watching. In the cancer villages, nobody was watching, or more precisely, nobody was allowed to. So where does this leave things now? There are signs of effort. China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment reported that targeted cleanup of a Yellow River tributary in Baotou resulted in ammonia nitrogen levels dropping by 84.6% since 2012. Pollution fines have been uncapped, meaning the worst corporate offenders now face unlimited penalties. Some of the most egregious factories have officially been shut down. NGOs and citizen campaigns have won small but hard-fought victories. But cleanup at this scale is generational work, and the obstacles are enormous. Local officials still have structural incentives to protect industrial revenues over environmental compliance. Data manipulation remains common. Different government agencies regularly publish contradictory figures on pollution levels, making it nearly impossible to track real progress. Factories that close often quietly reopen under new names or shift operations to a different province. The groundwater contamination accumulated over 30 years will not be reversed in 5 or 10 or perhaps 20. And the cancer villages, they're not a relic of the past. They're still forming, 7 per year on average. Today, residents in contaminated zones are drilling deeper wells to try to escape the worst surface contamination. But the poisons have migrated downward too, following the water table, chasing people through the soil. The crisis doesn't stop. It just moves deeper. And Beijing, despite the cleanup announcements, still have not released a comprehensive national map of where the worst contamination sits. That information remains to this day largely absent from public records. The full count of cancer villages may never be known. Beijing doesn't publish one. Journalists are still blocked from many affected areas. Citizens who speak out still face arrest. And the underlying logic that created this, growth above all, GDP above human health, has not fundamentally changed. China's economic miracle is real. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and built the infrastructure that the modern world runs on. And to be fair, parts of the Chinese government understand the scale of what's being built and the scale of what has to be cleaned up. But in the cancer villages, the cost of that miracle is measured differently. It's measured in savings wiped out by chemotherapy that arrives too late, in children diagnosed with cancers that have no business existing in childhood, in families reduced to waiting, in an elderly man who wakes up each morning just to await death in a country whose prosperity he helped build with his labor and his land and his silence. The cancer villages are not an accident of industrialization. They're the receipt, a hidden bill that comes due when a society decides that growth matters more than the people growing it. Something terrifying is spreading across rural China, not as a metaphor, not a distant abstraction, not as a story from the past that has since been resolved. Right now, as you watch this, the same pattern is repeating somewhere new. Factory upstream, river downstream, families in between. So here is what we'll leave you with today. At what point does cheap technology become too expensive? And if the world helped build this system, does the world share responsibility for dismantling it? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because these are the stories that matter most when nobody else is watching.